who had been excommunicated in 1521, and Ulrich Zwingli, 1484 to 1531, and making friends among those who sympathized with German Lutherans. After the death of his father in 1531, John, who had Latinized his family name Cauvin to Calvinus or Calvin, returned to Paris to study ancient languages and completed his first book, a commentary on Seneca's Treatise on Clemency, published in the spring of 1532. It was considered a brilliant work, though not exactly a commercial success. The next 2 years thrust the studious Calvin into the first of many controversies. After a friend, Nicholas Kopp, stirred up a controversy with an address that included reformational themes, Kopp and Calvin fled Paris to avoid arrest. Calvin later said that about this time he experienced a sudden conversion, being convicted of the authority of the Scriptures and sensing a personal call to obedience. Consequently, in May 1534 he returned briefly to Nyon to disengage from his church benefices, separating him from the Roman Church in the most fundamental and practical sense. By late in 1534, the French king, Francis I, now himself the target of the most ardent French Protestants, was denouncing and threatening anarchist Protestants. Turning his words to action, he had Protestants jailed and executed. Tens of thousands are said to have been martyred, with entire villages sometimes decimated. Calvin fled France and sought refuge in the Protestant territory of Basel, Switzerland. It was in these formative years, in his mid-20s, that he also formulated the initial outline of the rudimentary edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was first published in Latin in 1536. The Road to Leadership. As summer approached in 1536, after a brief trip to Italy and back into France, Calvin and a brother and stepsister set out for the free city of Strasbourg, where Calvin expected to continue his scholarly pursuits. But strife between France and the Holy Roman Empire forced the travelers to take a serious detour through Geneva, Switzerland. In terms of the history of Europe, that change of itinerary has nearly biblical significance. As the Gospel writer says of Jesus, he must needs go through Samaria, John 4:4. So it seemed Calvin needed to sojourn to Geneva. As the author of the Institutes, Calvin's scholastic reputation preceded him. At that time, the work was presented in a basic question-and-answer format, similar to Luther's Little Catechism. News spread of his arrival and prompted quick action on the part of Guillaume Farel, 1489 to 1565, a dynamic, impetuous acquaintance of Calvin's who had swayed much of French-speaking Switzerland toward Protestantism. Farel immediately confronted Calvin and threatened him with the wrath of God if he didn't stay in Geneva, which, allied with the city of Bern, had months earlier declared itself Protestant, no longer under the control of a Catholic bishop or Savoyard duke. Calvin submitted to what he perceived to be God's call upon his life. I was so terror-stricken that I did not continue my journey. He settled in Geneva to help lead the church and thus the city. At first, Calvin gave biblical lectures. Then he preached. For years, Geneva had maintained citizens' councils, and in 1537, Farel and Calvin presented the city's little council with governmental and ecclesiastical recommendations, which were adopted in a modified form. But opposition fomented, fueled by the neighboring city of Bern, and by the fact that Calvin was a fiery foreigner. In April 1538, Farel and Calvin were both banished from the city. Calvin at last moved on to Strasbourg, where he pastored French refugees, lectured, wrote a commentary on Romans, revised and expanded his Institutes, and, with the encouragement of a mentor, Martin Bucer, found a wife. In 1540, then 31, after discounting several suggested prospects, Calvin married a parishioner. An attractive, intelligent mother of two, Idelette was the recent widow of John Storter, an articulate Anabaptist leader who had joined Calvin's church. Calvin took the Storter children as his own. No child born to Idelette and John survived infancy. Idelette died in 1549, having been ill for some time, possibly with tuberculosis. John never remarried.